Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar and lecture with Professor Max Koch about power and the state in degrowth transition. And Max Koch is Professor of Social Policy and Sustainability at the School of Social Work at Lund University. And my name is Åsa Svanfeldt, and I'm a researcher in the Mr. Sustainable Consumption Program. And we also have Jonathan Järbel in the background, who is responsible for communication in the program. And that is all I had to say right now. So then I will just let you in, Max. And I'm very happy that you accepted to present in this webinar series. And I really look forward to your presentation and the questions afterwards.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Åsa, for having me, and hello to everyone. I'll try to share my screen now. A moment. Yeah. Okay. As Åsa said, the presentation is about power and the state and degrowth transformation. I'm talking about the background within which this kind of work has developed, which is the climate and planetary emergency. I will give you an overview how we theorize degrowth transformation, both a bit in general and then specifically in relation to power and the state, whereby I will make use of this book, which has just been published and which you can download for free. This is that link I've put in the chat. And then I will also show you how we in Lund study degrowth transformations empirically and get an idea of real existing power asymmetries in the Swedish population. So we will look at quantitative survey data on the support for eco-social policies, and also on habitus groups in Sweden, which are closer or further away from the kind of social ecological transformations we probably all would like to see. And we also look a bit at qualitative data from deliberative citizen forums that we have carried out mainly in southern Sweden. So starting with the background of my work, the IPCC, in its last report, and the Alliance of World Scientists call for quick and drastic transformations to happen in this decade. And we shouldn't forget that this decade is again halfway over again. And they say, in rather unprecedentedly clear-cut terms, that economic growth must be quickly curtailed to maintain long-term sustainability in the biosphere. The goals of economic and other policy making need to shift from GDP growth towards sustaining ecosystems and improving human well-being by prioritizing basic needs and reducing inequality. This statement echoes comparative studies, for example, by Tim Parikh and others, and Harbal and others. Both of them were cited, I think, over 600 times, showing that attempts to absolutely decouple GDP growth from resource use and greenhouse gas emissions either failed totally or did not reach the extent necessary to meet the Paris climate targets. The policy implications are then that decoupling needs to be complemented by sufficiency-oriented strategies and strict enforcement of absolute reduction targets, in the case of Harbal and others, and a deprioritization of GDP growth as overall target and policy making in the report by Parikh and others. So this is basically due to this situation that green growth in all its variants is very unlikely to give the required answers. Why I ended up in researching degrowth. Now, there are many definitions on this, but this is a shorthand definition on which most of the representatives of this broad movement probably can agree on. So first of all, the economy should be seen as a biophysical process. That is, in Marxian terms, use value would be highlighted rather than exchange value. It is about a reduction of matter and energy throughput and the scale of the economy via voluntary changes in production and consumption patterns. This right sizing, which is a downsizing in our part of the world, is to be democratically deliberated without undermining critical levels of well-being. The start should be in the global north as soon as possible, which actually allows for development space in the global south. As I said, there are a lot of different degrowth definitions in circulation, but in one or the other way, these three elements will figure. Now, I am probably one of the last persons who would say that a transformation of this caliber is a walk in the park. We have been grappling with the associated complexity for quite a while now, and for example, in the book that I wrote with Milena Büchs in 2017 called Post-Growth and Well-Being, what you see here on the right-hand side of this graph is a range of well-known institutions of Western society, for example, the political system, media, education, including academia, and of course the welfare state, which all evolved in parallel and linked with the provision of economic growth, particularly in the post-war era, where you had these kind of spectacular GDP growth rates of sometimes 10% annually. Now, all these societal subsystems are interlinked in many ways, which means if you change one of them, that has implications for the others. So there is a danger that basically taking one of the pieces, especially the central one, which is market capitalism and the growth paradigm, if you take this out of the equation, that you produce something that classical sociologists such as Emile Durkheim called anomie. That's basically a disjointment between one's acquired values and the social environment. So if you think about well-being as a central thing, everybody in degrowth wants to keep at least critical levels of well-being. You see that this is a product of a range of macro, meso, and micro social structures, and is produced and reproduced in a range of social practices. So we have here, in many ways, a complexity problem that, all kinds of great transformations, not only degrowth transformations, have to grapple with. You need to change the societal core institutions in a parallel way and at roughly the same speed in order to avoid social exclusion, enemy, and alienation. This can also be analyzed at the individual level. The growth paradigm is inscribed not only in institutions, but also in our minds, bodies, and a range of social practices perceived as the natural way of doing things. It is inscribed in our ideas of progress, career success, and status, cost-benefit calculations, individualism, and competition. So a degrowth transformation would presuppose also a rather fundamental change in values and an acceptance of alternative well-being goals that is, well, under democratic circumstances, not so easy. At least at the time, Milena Büchs and I, we couldn't came up with the historic examples where changes of that caliber were carried out in a rather short term and under democratic circumstances. In the new book, which has which has been published this week, called Deep Transformation, the Theory of Degrowth, my colleagues Hubert Buchansen, Jana Nesterova, and you'll be thinking about the associated complexity of degrowth transformations in slightly more advanced terms. So I said that a range of institutions and values would need to change in parallel and at similar speed to avoid enemy. And we are now, in this book, trying to understand this in a bit more concrete way. We provide a theoretical combination of critical realism, heterodox political economy, and Bourdieusian sociology. The theoretical framework in many ways builds on what Hubert Buchansen and Jana Nesterova has already published in terms of their applications of critical realism to degrowth. So we analyze, following their lead in the book, we analyze 4 planes of social being, which is the material transaction with nature, social interactions, social structures, and the inner being. And a bit like, as I said before, for degrowth transformations to arise, we would need to see more or less parallel changes on all of what critical realists call the planes of social existence or beings. And we also kind of analyze this at 3 sites of social action: the business and the economy, civil society, and the state, which are not the only ones, but rather central ones. And we look at different scales of social practices, local, national, and transnational. In order to kind of filtrate our ideas about power and the state for you from this kind of thinking, I'm looking now especially at the social structures as one of the 4 planes of social being, and then I will look at the state as one of the 3 sides that we are talking about in the book. So the social structures of capitalist societies is a contradictory issue in many ways. Capitalist reproduction is always a unity of production and circulation of commodities. The commodities is, of course, a central term within a political economy, especially Marxian political economy, because it's particular to capitalism that labor products take on the form of commodities. That means they are produced to be sold on markets in the first place. And in order to do so, they must not only be produced by using some kind of labor and transform resources, natural resources with it, but they must also be sold, which is the circulation of commodities. Now we have different implications from both spheres of accumulation of capital, of commodities, the production and circulation. As far as the circulation of commodities or markets are concerned, we, and this goes back to Marx, basically we find that the legal and political equality of citizens That means the individual owners of commodities are actually structural preconditions for exchange relations to take place. So as far as only markets are concerned, democracy, inequality, legal sovereignty of individual citizens and autonomous citizens are well, a reality, and they are actually structural preconditions for commodities to be sold. It's different when we look at the production sphere of capitalism, of capitalist commodities. Here in this reign, we find, well, structures of inequality, exploitation, and exclusion. Now, this goes, of course, back to Marx's original discussion of surplus value and his I think still unique contribution in explaining how it can be that in a society of political and legal equals, independent and equal owners of commodities, nevertheless inequality and exploitation can be reproduced. No, well, his solution at the time was, of course, that there is one commodity for sale, the labor power, whose whose use value it is to produce actually exchange value, and it can be used longer than the equivalent of its own value is. So inequality can, in this case, be compatibilized with economic inequality, and social inequality is compatible with legal and political equality. So since Marx, then, social scientists have grappled with this issue, how this can actually be possible. Now, on the one hand, our societies have established, citizenship. They have more or less developed democracies, but nevertheless, we have inequalities rates that are now likened to the 19th century. If you think of the work by Thomas Piketty, Lucas Chancel, and others. But all this is in perfect harmony with the laws we have and with the principles of equivalence that reign market exchanges. So the social structure appears then, of course, not only as a matter of exploitation. Exploitation is a concrete case where the work of others is appropriated to basically to gain an advantage for myself, an exchange of surplus labor and an appropriation of surplus labor. There are other executions of power, like exclusion, where the group or the person in power benefits from the fact that the oppositional part simply disappears. No, a famous example was, of course, Northern America, no, where the American saying of white people used to be, the only good worker is a dead worker. Sorry, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, whilst no one would have come to the idea to say only a good worker, only a dead worker is a good worker. So in one case, basically the benefit for the person in power comes from the disappearance and the exclusion from the opponent from generally desired resources, and in the other case, the opponent is actually necessary and a structural precondition to produce a similar outcome. But the work is necessary and can, of course, not at shorthand be, well, eliminated. In more concrete cases, of course, the social structures and power relations are not only class relations based on exploitation, but are based on a diversity of exclusionary relations, for example, in the guises of gender and race relations, all of which include structural power asymmetries where one or the other group is able to make gains at the expense of others, to take Max Weber's famous definition. Now I come to the state. The state was originally also defined by Max Weber as that institution that monopolizes the legitimate use of power. And in the book or in other parts of my work, I try to understand how the state can actually be understood and used in degrowth transformations. But in order to do that, we first need to understand what the state does in capitalist growth economies. And I suggest to look at three topics here. So first is economic development, which is of course oriented at monetary growth in capitalism. We may look at state spatiality, basically the spatial target where much of state regulation takes place. And we look at economic, social, and environmental state policies. Now, the first of all, and all kind of political economists agree on that the state need to ensure the rule of law. No, this has to do with the rules of circulation that I have explained before. Commodities must be sold. And for that, a third institution, I mean, an institution that is not directly involved in exchange relations, need to guarantee private property, the principle of equivalence, and the legal security of economic subjects. So basically, you need an institutions in order that labor equivalence can be exchanged. And almost all political economists, from Milton Friedman to Karl Marx, would basically say, yeah, this is necessary. Much less agreement among political economists of different colors reigns in relation to the second role, the welfare state, which legitimizes social inequality and maintains a minimum of social inclusion. If we said that according to Marx, much of the social relations take on a commodified form, not only labor products take the form of commodities, then the welfare state basically reverses that to some extent and decommodifies social relations, allowing certain groups, for example, students, sick people, old people, and others, to basically exist without having to sell their labor power at all instances. No, this goes back to the Danish political economist Esping Andersen, and we find different ways in different Western countries as to do this. And there's the environmental state, which addresses problems of externalization of environmental costs. No, this is very similar. It also tries to basically cope with the things that the market regulation has given us, and tries to externalize these costs as much as possible. Now, the second one is the state spatiality aspect, no, which political geographers especially discuss. There's always a delicate structure of state regulation subject to and rescaling processes. There are multi-scalar structures of state organization, political authority, and regulation that keep emerging. And in Europe, the national and the European levels of state regulations were most important. Increasingly, it is the European one. And then you have different policies. You may distinguish between economic, social, and environmental policies. There's the macroeconomic management and the intermediation of corporatist processes, which can be more of a demand or more of a supply character. Social policies traditionally decommodified the labor power, but in the last 30 or 40 years, they increasingly recommodify them. And in the case that they make work pay, social activation policies also try to bring especially unemployment policy in employment at virtually all costs. And there are environmental policies that are meant to produce green growth, for example, via carbon taxation or carbon markets. Well, then we could look a bit at what the state could actually do, and I would say what it should do, provided the majorities for it were there. Again, we have the economic development, which would now be seen increasingly as a biophysical process, as I also said when I tried to shortly define degrowth. In Marxian terms, we would have more of use value orientation now rather than an exchange value orientations. So states would ensure that production and consumption patterns do not exceed environmental limits. They would define limits for economic and social inequality, and they would steer new governance networks of state, collective, communal, and private property forms and actors to basically carry out the kind of goals we would like to see. There would be a slightly different spatial target in state policies. It would be a combination of the global and the local level. At the global level, we would need to identify the thresholds for matter and energy throughput that we should better not transgress. Here, of course, the planetary boundary framework is very important. Or you can think of carbon budgets, which are increasingly concrete. We know quite well what we can still consume in terms of fossil fuels in order not to transgress the Paris climate goals, for example. And we could then break this down to transnational, national, and local levels, and states would, of course, be well positioned to turn these goals into practice. So such thresholds would delineate the leeways within which national and local economies can actually still evolve. And in terms of economic and eco-social policies, it would be orientation at sustainable welfare, especially a needs orientation through a redistribution of wealth, income, and pollution rights. It would be a management of a mixed economy, ensuring the provision of sufficient needs satisfiers, not only for people, for the happy few in the West, but for all people now and also for future people. The needs concept that we use in much of our work allows actually for this kind of science fiction dialogue between present and future generations, because it is safe to assume that also future generation will be in need, for example, of drinkable water and habitable territories. So it would, these policies, state policies would try to channel the production and consumption patterns towards a safe and just operating space as defined by the Stockholm Resilience Center, Kate Raworth, and many others. Policies would be then oriented both at social floors, which is the minimum level of need satisfactions, which we need. These minimums are required, otherwise what Ian Gough calls serious harm would follow for us. And there are, outer ecological ceilings, And we would need to move production and consumption patterns basically toward this safe and just operating space, which would be the target for eco-social policies. Now I come to the more empirical part of the lecture. So we've done a range of surveys and forums in how the population actually looks at eco-social policies, ideas to respect social flaws and ecological ceilings, or moving production and consumption patterns towards this safe operating space. So then it is on the one hand about limiting things, and on the other hand about allowing things, enabling things. And it is safe to say that in terms of limiting things like space, the number of flights, income, all these ideas are not very popular in the Swedish population, whilst the idea of enabling things via universal basic systems, be it for public transport, electricity, or the internet, or water, this is very popular, actually. So you can say roughly that establishing and ensuring social flaws is something that the Swedish population is very much behind. I mean, a majority. Whilst the drawing of ecological ceilings is much more complicated. This is, by the way, this is something we want to explore further, by the way, in new research. We had made a calculation, for example, about the caps on wealth and income, which is here a limit income. You see that over 50% are against limiting income from wealth and work at 2 million euros annually. So that means 100% taxation for further incomes per year would kick in. And not too many people of us would be actually affected by such a tax. Or by such a cap, maybe 2 or 3% we calculated, but still, you see, over 50% are absolutely against this. No? So we in new research, we want to understand a little bit more the roles of economic elites in society and specifically in social ecological transformations. This goes actually beyond the absolutely ungeneralizable ecological footprint of economic elites with their yachts and private planes, etc. But we need also to understand better the symbolic power of these elites, which allows them to lead almost absurd lifestyles and be considered at the same time as role models for everyone. So we want to understand better, and I think we need all to understand better the role of the rich in social ecological transformations. But I am today not talking so much about that. I'm coming back a little bit to our model of the planes of existence, which were here on the left then, the material transactions with nature, the interactions with others, the social structures of which I've talked a little bit, which has a lot to do with power relations, and the inner being, the level of all of us. We all need to transform ourselves to. That's what Jana Nestorova and Hubert Buchansen in their work refer to as self-transformation. Despite all the social pressures we are grappling with, there's still an element that we can do ourselves. Now, with the same set of data, and I recommend you the article about it in the British Journal of Sociology, because I don't have time to introduce you to all the methodological detail. This is a Bourdieusian methodology where we basically form clusters of different viewpoints towards social ecological transformations, and we found basically 7 groups in Sweden, and it is interesting for degrowth transformation that there is only one group, which we called fossil liberalism, representing about 10% of the population, that is skeptical to degrowth transformations on all planes of existence. That means ideas about the material transactions with nature, interactions with other social structures and inner being. And there is one group, fortunately twice as big, which we call active sustainable welfare, which is actually open to and supporting corresponding suggestions and ideas. All the other social groups we have, or habitus groups, as we call this in slightly more theoretically advanced terms, are mixes. That means they are supportive of degrowth transformations on one kind of on one plane of social being and skeptical on others, which allows for a little bit more targeted political approach. Also, if we think of assisting mobilization strategies, now targeted for different habitus groups. And rather briefly, because I think maybe 5 minutes left or so, one way of doing that, of assisting societal mobilizations towards social ecological transformations, is co-developing eco-social policies by deliberative means. No? That was another project we have done in Lund, applying the human scale methodology by Max Neef. No, was similar to the need theory of Ian Gough. There's a limited number of human needs that have to be satisfied. Otherwise, we would face harm of one of or other kind. And we looked at in this project. We carried out 11 of these deliberative forums, and we discussed with participants, how do you satisfy your basic needs currently? In the second round, we would ask them, how can you imagine to do that in a utopian, that is sustainable way? And in the third round, we discussed how to get from A to B. So, and what you produce together is a so-called needs matrix, where you have on the one side basically Max Neef basic needs, and then you have positive or negative needs satisfiers. So while needs in themselves are universal, that means they remain more or less the same over centuries and across regions. The way these needs are satisfied change, fortunately, and can be done more or less sustainably. Yeah, I will here only make some examples. I refer you to a lot of publications we have done on that, but I see this as a very commendable a method to actually co-develop eco-social policies in cooperation with researchers and lay persons, and as a way of bringing together the codified knowledge that people like us can contribute with the practical knowledge on the ground of that only people have who actually live in certain circumstances and neighborhoods. So here we have now a combination of the planes of existence again, and now we have also our sites of actions, the civil society, state, and business. And if we look at negative need satisfier, you find, for example, corporate social media, anthropocentrism, perfectionism, and productivity as negative need satisfiers on the inner being scale. When it comes to material transactions with nature, forum participants highlighted the fossil fuel dependency and profit-driven transport system, the overall policy priority of economic growth and monocultures. The interaction between us is too much, according to our participants anyway, driven by competitiveness, not so much treating others as equals. And there were also some concerns with the representative democratic system, whereby I have to say, and I don't want to be quoted falsely here, no one of our forum participants, and neither me or my colleagues would want to abolish the representative democratic system, but we see some space for complementing it with deliberative instruments to make it a bit more worthwhile. And of course, there were the social structures, and this is only one or two examples for each. That we have several. The social structures that I've talked about, including all its power structures, are kind of often reproduced in school and education system by rather standardized teaching practices, a bit like what I'm doing now, the ex cathedra teaching methods where one teaches and talks and everyone else listens. All these things could be done in a much more interactive and egalitarian ways. And to just give you some examples, and then I come to finish about the utopian or positive need satisfiers, also by planes of social being and sites of degrowth transformations that have been highlighted. So people would like to see, with people I mean forum participants would like to see advertisement-free zones, better infrastructures for cycling and walking, sufficiency as a general orientations that relates to material transactions with nature. In terms of interactions, I think I said that already. A lot of the forum participants, I think that's probably part of the reason why they got there in the first place. They would like to have a more important position, a more important standing of citizen forums, or maybe climate assemblies, to get to grips with the issues we have. Sorry, I have a bit of a cough, which I'm happy to come to the end now. So yeah, working time reductions, universal basic income, universal basic services were something that could be seen as having a potential to do something about power structures in the plane of social structures, and mindfulness, meditation, the general ethos of care would be something that could structure, or should structure, our inner being much more as a precondition to see to bring about the changes I guess most of us would like to see. So I conclude: the complexity of degrowth transformation and the intersection of power relations is best understood, of course, I say that, in terms of different planes of social being, as well as sites and scales of social practices. But there is an empirical gap between the quantitative survey, our quantitative survey results, and the qualitative forum data in relation to the support of transformational policies. which is why at the moment I don't see much alternative as to expand the alternative spaces that we already have as measures of counter-training, in Bourdieu's terminology, such as, for example, citizen forums or assemblies where eco-social policies are actually co-developed at national, local, and European levels. So if we do not if we're not able to do this together and democratically, it wouldn't be a degrowth transformation, because democracy is well, part of the core definition of it. And if you'd like to read a little bit more about all these issues, you can look up some of these publications, especially, of course, the new book. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Max, for that very interesting presentation. And now I have one question already in the, and that was about one of your slides. So perhaps you could open that, or if you know already, it's about in one of your slides, I think it was with the role of the state. You had a note about the left hand, and this question, what does that mean? What is it?
That is a, sorry, I didn't explain it on the, this is a Bourdieusian a terminology used by Pierre Bourdieu in his work on the state. He says that the state can be understood both as in terms of the left hand and the right hand of the state, where the right hand of the state would represent much of the, you know, the police force, the military, the legal apparatus, also that aspect of the state that actually executes power on people in rather material ways. But Bourdieu was maybe similar to people like Gramsci or Poulantzas, who would also see that the state has also a civilizing element, especially the welfare state. And we could probably count in here also parts of the environmental state as well. So that part of the state that actually decommodifies social relations would be part of the so-called left hand of the state. And there is a constant struggle, according to Bourdieu, between state representatives in the kind of social and welfare departments on the one hand, also the environmental, where you still have an environmental ministry, of course, vis-a-vis the economic department and the, you know, the legal and defense ministries. And this is something, these struggles are not taking place, so to speak, in isolation, but are related to wider struggles in civil societies. That means that citizens, in principle, can influence on what happens within the state, while they are also, so to speak, at the losing end of the policies that comes from the state. So state-civil society relations is actually something that is also very important, which I did not refer to here. But I have a paper on this too in ecological economics, if you want to look it up.
Thank you. Okay, then there is a question about your slides, if we can share the slides.
Sure,
this will be recorded, so we will see the slides afterwards in the recording. The slides themselves. Could we share them?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, we try to do that in some way. Okay, then another question is, do you think it's a good idea to put GDP per capita goals or even limits according to the social floors and ecological ceilings?
If I understand, also I think we need limits to we need to identify certain thresholds for different elements of matter and energy consumption. and need to break them down to regulatory levels, also considering our colonial past here in this part of the world. If we want to leave this world in a habitable state, which we can with some good consciousness leave to the following generations. And given this almost totally lacking evidence for absolute decoupling of GDP growth and resource use, well, GDP should actually not be a parameter in this. So we need to replace it with biophysical parameters, transforming from financial, monetary measurements to kind of in-kind measurements, which is of course not easy, but I don't see much of an alternative to that.
And also to break them down to per capita.
Both per capita and in general. I mean, of course, but per capita is the best comparative measurement, no? Where you I mean, there's a lot of China bashing, for example, in sustainability discourses, which or India bashing for this and that policy. Of course, this relativizes it a little if you take per capita GDP here and then calculate the ecological debt. So I'm not saying that these countries are not without responsibility, but of course per capita is a good starting point for these kind of calculations for carbon and other budgets that I have in mind.
Thank you. And then on the mixed economy topic, do you imagine a post-capitalist degrowth economy or a capitalist degrowth? Post-capitalist or capitalist?
Well, I think it's fair to say it would be a post-capitalist economy in the sense that markets would not be the most important steering instrument. So we would need to see some kind of new planning economy. This is related to the carbon budgets we have, and the market regulation would need to take place within these set limits that we have. A very good approach towards understanding that is the Richard Berntaler and Ian Gough's notion of consumption corridor, not production corridors, which complements the more known concept of consumption corridors, which tries to distinguish between a luxury a sector of the economy, an essential sector, and an in-between sector. And I would agree with these authors that the luxury sector would need to be abolished straight away, more or less by corresponding state policies. The essential sector is everything we associate with care and is very important. This would be an area where universal basic systems, about which I talked a little bit, would need to be important and should expand. And then there is what they call the in-between economy, a lot of, small-scale private industries where market regulations would be most appropriate. So I am not for abolishing markets, but for well, how to put this? Well, I'm for a new division of labor of planning, markets, and commons, where the role of state planning and commons would be much greater than currently.
Okay. Okay. So the next question is, I don't think I'm not sure if we have time for all the questions, but I'll pose one of them. Are non-human or more than human needs discussed in the degrowth field? And if not, do you have any thoughts on the potential of integrating such perspectives in the degrowth movement and literature?
No, this is definitely necessary. We need more discussion on it. In this book that I mentioned, we have it under further research that is necessary to be done. But of course, when we talk about diversity targets, for example, this is at least implicitly there. But I think the dialogues between kind of experts on non-human being needs also must be intensified. I do not pretend to be an expert on that, but I think this is very important to do more.
Okay, yes, I'll try with one more question. I'll see. How do you see the state balance the tensions between democratic processes and necessary actions?
Necessary action by whom?
It continues here. That is procedural justice versus urgency and distributive justice. As you said, there is a call for more democratic processes. However, at the same time, a majority of people are not interested in sufficiency policies limits to incomes, even if most never even reach the 2 million euro income status.
Now, I mean, this is of course a very central question, which I find difficult to answer, especially for other people. I wouldn't be in the position to do that. I can only say that so far the degrowth movement in general has aligned itself with democratic and non-violent means in basically trying to push through what it wants to push through. I don't think that this should be changed. But when it comes, for example, to civil disobedience without carrying out violence of some kind, then I think that most of the people in degrowth would be open for that. But of course, this is a matter that anyone else has to decide. So I think that, but I'm not a democracy expert either. The historical experiences with civil disobedience have not necessarily weakened democracy, but have often kind of resulted in responses that have deepened democracy as such. And as such, I would think, for example, a blockage of like in Germany last year, for example, of a big coal field, or where they, even though they have decided to phase out coal, that they still clear territories for new coal mines, that this is a legitimate thing to do.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I think those are all the questions that we have time for, because it's now 10 o'clock. Thank you very much, Max, for presenting and your thoughts and answering the questions, and we will have a bit more discussion after this.
Yeah, in 15
so thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, I will also just say that we have another lecture in this webinar series on June the 5th. It is with Helene Ahlborg, who is associate professor at Chalmers, and she will talk about relational and socio-material approaches to power in sustainability transitions. So you can have a look out for that in social media. Thank you very much for today.